Well, let me begin by saying what a pleasure it is to be here at Imperial. It's a great place. And also talk about science a bit. I used to be a scientist myself. My first degree was chemistry. And then I kind of sidetracked a bit and did my doctorate in molecular biophysics. And I worked with a guy called George Rader. Some of you may know him. He ended up being the chief executive of the Medical Research Council. And I loved science. In fact, I think it's probably the first thing I ever started loving. I mean, I remember when I was about 6 or 7, building a little telescope so I could look at the night sky, got a microscope so I could look at pond life. And you begin to experience this sense. Nature is really interesting, really engaging, and wanting to know more about it. And for me, at high school, it was just obvious that science was what I was going to do. And science for me was something very, very exciting, very, very significant. And while I was at school, I developed this very strong sense that if you wanted to be a scientist, you had to be anti-religious. I had this fixed idea, I think, that science and religion just didn't mix. And I have to say, rather aggressive atheist views. In fact, when I read Richard Dawkins these days, which I do quite often, I feel all nostalgic because I used to kind of think like that myself. You probably know the idea, if you believe in God, you're kind of mad, bad, or sad, or possibly all three. And I bought into that in a very, very big way. And so I went up to Oxford to study chemistry, feeling that this would simply confirm my atheism. And I have to tell you, this didn't happen. I'm actually talking to you as a lapsed atheist. I mean, I don't have anything against atheism, let me make it absolutely clear, but I have moved position on this one. Let me try and tell you what thoughts went through my mind and see if this makes any kind of sense to you. I went to Oxford to study chemistry just feeling that science proved its beliefs, that religion was kind of running away from reality, not taking evidence seriously. And it just seemed to me there could be no common ground at all between them. And I think a number of things began to happen. One of them, I think, was the realization that actually perhaps atheism wasn't as well grounded as I'd thought. The other was, I think, that I didn't really understand what Christianity was. I kind of had picked it up at school as being something that some people believed, that encouraged you to do certain things that didn't seem very interesting to me and discouraged you from doing certain things that seemed much more interesting. And so I kind of just felt this was not something that was for me at all. But at Oxford, I think there were two things that happened. One was that I discovered that there were a lot of thinking Christians who actually had very successfully held together their science and their faith, including a lot of quite senior academics. And they simply said, look, here's a simple way of trying to understand this. One way of thinking about this is to say that science offers one perspective on reality and faith offers a different. These might be in tension, but actually they are allowing you to see things from two different angles, and that is a richer viewpoint than any one approach allows in itself. But I think the main thing that really got me excited was this, the realization that if Christianity was right, it gives you an intellectual framework which really makes sense of life, but above all, makes sense of what the sciences are, why they're so good, and also what their limits are. And there's a quote I came across much later in the writings of C.S. Lewis, who I enjoy reading very, very much. He and I both came from Belfast. I think both of us lost our Belfast accents. But here is what Lewis said. It's the end of a lecture he gave in Oxford in the 1940s, and he's trying to sum up why he moved from atheism to Christianity. And this is a sentence, and I think you'll find it quite interesting. He says, "I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." And what Lewis is really trying to say is that, look, Christianity gives you this way of looking at the world that makes sense of things. It's like a sun rising on a landscape. It begins to burn away the mist, it begins to illuminate the shadows, and you see more clearly, see further than otherwise you might do. And for me, that was very exciting, because I'd thought that kind of way you had to shut down all your mental processes if you wanted to be a religious person. And discovering that A, Christianity had some very exciting ideas, and B, that these actually made sense of my own experience and the world around me, including the sciences. Well, that was really something that began to blow me away. So I suppose you could say I had a conversion. It was a very intellectual conversion. I didn't feel the need for God at all, but it just seemed that this was the way it was going to be. But what I want to do is explore an image that may help you think about this. And what I'm going to suggest is we all need a big picture of life. Okay, that's the image. It's very, very simple. We all need a big picture of life. And the question I think I was wrestling with as a younger person was, well, you know, science is very, very good and fills in part of that picture. But what about the rest of it? I mean, if I can put it like this, is truth, is our understanding of the world limited to what science can tell us? Or is there more? Is there a kind of bigger picture which lies partly beyond science, which science can supplement, but actually there's something else there? Now, some of you will see what I'm getting at immediately, but let me try and open it up. Some of you will have read the philosopher Karl Popper. He's one of the better philosophers of science, and he uses the phrase ultimate questions. Okay, ultimate questions. Now, what does he mean by that? What he means is really big questions in life. The kind of questions that you and I might turn over in our minds late at night. The sort of things that very often are uncomfortable questions, but we know they need to be answered. What is the point of life? Why is there something rather than nothing? How do I live the good life? How do I decide what is good? What's the point of me being here? And these are all perfectly good questions. I think we would cease to be human beings if we didn't begin to ask those questions. What I began to realize is that science actually didn't really give very good answers to those questions. And that's no criticism of science. It's just saying, look, science is science. And let's love it for what it does. But let's not force it to do things it's not meant to do. And so really what I'm saying is, are there these big questions we need to wrestle with? Now, some of you will have heard of Sir Peter Medawar, who won the Nobel Prize for Medicine about 50 years ago. And Medawar was a rationalist, didn't like religion at all, but he was very, very clear that there were limits to what science could tell us. And at the end of his life, he wrote a book called The Limits of Science, in which he tried to open this up. I'm going to tell you what he says. He's not a religious man at all. He's just reflecting on his lifelong experience as a scientist and trying to ask where this took him and his readers. Here's what he says. He says, it's obvious to me as a scientist that there are some questions that lie beyond the capacity of science to answer. He gives some examples, and indeed they're very similar to the ones I gave. What's the point of life? Why are we here? He gave a few more. But you see the point he's trying to make. These are real questions. And Medawar said, look, I think we've got two options here. One is we say these are non-questions. These are sort of stupid questions that only very, very unwise people raise. There are no answers to them, and we delude ourselves we think there are. We focus on science, and we limit ourselves to what science can say. What Medawar said was then very interesting. He said, look, we can't do that. We're human beings. All scientists are human beings. And that means we do ask these deeper existential questions about the meaning of life, about why we're here, and hope to find some way of answering them. And so if we go back to that image I gave you of a big picture, what I'm suggesting is that science is very, very good at filling in part of that picture, but not all of it. And what I want to suggest to you is that to lead meaningful lives, we need a bigger picture than that. And that's not about contradicting science. It's not about actually criticizing science in any way, unless you think science, in effect, answers everything, and then there's nothing else to think about. I don't think that's right. I think that science in many ways is brilliant at throwing up these very rich questions, but it doesn't always give us the ability to answer them. I mentioned Karl Popper. Let me mention another name. This is Sir Isaiah Berlin, okay? Isaiah Berlin, some of you will have heard of him. He was one of Britain's best intellectual historians, a very significant philosopher who died about 20 years ago. And Berlin was fascinated by the question, what do people need to lead meaningful lives? And I mean, he himself thought he sorted this one out, but he was very, very clear there were multiple answers to this question. So he was trying to categorize what sort of things made life meaningful. And in one of his essays, he gave us this framework. And I'm going to tell you about it and ask you what you think. He says, look, when we look at all the beliefs people hold, we can, in effect, put them in three boxes, three categories. First of all, those that can be proved by logic. And by that, he really means also mathematics. And he says this is a wonderful area of thought. Number two, things that can be proved by science. Number three, things you can't prove by either of those two ways. Now, so far so good, but here is the point that Berlin made. Simply by observing people, by reading what they wrote, he said, look, all the beliefs that give life meaning and purpose and value go in that third category. Now that will shock you, but actually it's right. And the real issue then is, well, what do we do about this? Now let me just go with this a little bit further, because some of you will say, well, we're not so sure about this, and I fully understand that. Let me just give you some ideas. Look, in mathematics and logic you can give proof. Absolutely, it's certain. But in other areas it's not quite so sure. For me, one of the enormous strengths of science is its willingness to correct itself. In other words, when it takes a wrong turn, it corrects itself. But that has, I think, one very important implication, which is that, if you just think of all the theories you've been taught to believe, and with very good reason, in a generation's time, some of those will be abandoned, either because they're inadequate or because they're wrong, and something better will come along. And this whole idea of the provisionality of scientific theories is very unsettling to some people. You may have read Michael Polanyi's book, Personal Knowledge. Polanyi was a chemist who was also a philosopher, and he said, look, I find myself in a dilemma. As a practicing chemist, I have all these ideas, all these theories, and actually every single one of them is well warranted. Very good reason thinking it's right, and is a commonplace inside the scientific community. But I know, in a generation's time, some of these will be abandoned. The difficulty is, I don't know which ones they are. And so Polanyi was really wrestling with this question, how could he avoid being a skeptic, saying, look, these could all be wrong? Or did he in effect say, look, I just have to trust this is the best way of seeing things at the moment, but science moves on, that's good. Science is on a journey, here is where it is at the moment, but we can't really predict where it's going to be. Now that may surprise some of you, but actually when you think about it, I think you see there's a real point here. Let's imagine that we are meeting on this site, obviously not in this lecture room, 100 years ago. And I'm giving you a talk, and it's going to be the scientific consensus on the origins of the universe. Except that would be a very short lecture, because the scientific consensus of 1916 was, well, the universe has always been here. The classic model of the time was that there may be localized redistribution of matter and energy, but basically the universe has always been here, and there's no reason to think otherwise. You and I think very differently today. It's almost like turning by 180 degrees. But we think we're right in making that very radical change, because that's the way the evidence sees to point. But just do a mental experiment, okay? You're going back, you're entering the mind of somebody in 1916, and you're saying, look, what would I say? What would you say to me if I told you 100 years from now they'd be saying the universe came into existence in a moment? Planck time is very, very short, and then began to expand. People would, it would just be incomprehensible. So what I'm trying to make is, I love science, it's wonderful, but it is on a journey, and that means we have to be careful about what we believe. But the real point is that third box that Isaiah Berlin talks about. Here are the kind of things he's saying. Democracy is better than fascism. Rape is wrong. It is good to help those who are oppressed. And he gives loads of these things, sort of things that I imagine most of you believe, and actually probably not just believe, but actually think are very important. And Berlin is just saying, look, when it comes to the crunch, you cannot prove that those are right. But in your heart, in your mind, you know they're right. You know there are good enough reasons to say this is right, even though you're absolutely sure you can't prove it. And the point that Berlin is making is actually bigger than you might think. He's actually talking about the condition that you and I face as human beings, which is that sure, we can prove some things to be true, but there are an awful lot of things which really matter, where we say something like this: look, we've got pretty good reason to think this is right, but we cannot absolutely prove, and we have to live with that tension. If you want a technical phrase, you could say it's about warranted belief or motivated belief, but it's not about proof. And this, I think, is where I and Richard Dawkins part ways. He and I are going to have a conversation at the big literary festival next month, which I'm looking forward to very much. I think this will probably be one of the things we talk about. Dawkins takes the view that science is able to prove all its core beliefs, and that should be true of any beliefs that you and I hold. He would give a classic example of belief that is indefensible as belief in God, because you can't prove it's right. I want to agree with him on one point: you cannot prove it's right. But I'm making a much bigger point, which some of you will find very unsettling. But I think once you see it, it really does give you a perspective on things. And that is, look, that you can prove shallow truths, but the deep truths, the things that have existential traction, the things that in effect give you a reason to get up in the morning, the things that keep you going, these actually lie beyond that kind of proof. It doesn't make them irrational. It's simply saying there are actually quite significant limits on what we're able to show to be right. And if you take a cultural commentator like Terry Eagleton of Manchester, Eagleton just says, look, it's just obvious. There are lots of truths we know we can't prove, but nevertheless, these are the truths by which we live. So that's the question I'm kind of putting in the air for you to think about. We need something to live by. Chemical structures may be very interesting, but they don't actually give you a moral framework. They don't give you this bigger picture that all of us need. And I'm not saying for one moment this means you say, oh, we'll leave science to one side. Don't do it, it's lovely. What I'm just saying is we need a bigger picture. I'm also just saying you need to be aware of the limits on reason. So this really brings me back to the whole issue of faith. Because some of you will say, well, look, what you're saying is quite interesting, but we just don't see how faith and science could possibly go together. So if I may, I'm just going to talk about that a little bit. One thing I want to say to you is that for me, actually bringing my science and my faith together was very, very important, and it can be done actually quite easily. But it's something where someone needs to just give you some ideas for you to go away and think about. Here are some ideas that you might find helpful. One of them is this. I mentioned multiple perspectives. If you think of life as being like a mountain or a very complicated building, you can see it from this angle, and then you walk around a bit more, you see it from this angle, looks different. Same building, but looks different. Go around a bit more. The multiple perspectives build up to give you a rich overall picture. Science gives you one angle of approach. Wonderful. But we need more than just that one angle of approach. Here's another approach, which is very much based on the idea of levels of meaning. It's an idea that once you've got it, actually really is quite helpful. This is an analogy given by Frank Rhodes, who was a British geologist who went on to be president of Cornell back in the late 1990s. He said, look, imagine you plug a kettle in and boil it, and ask this question: why is the kettle boiling? He says, well, look, one reason I can give is all about the conversion of energy. And he gives quite a complicated explanation of how that actually happens, which of course brings water to the boil. And he says that explanation is right. End of discussion. Well, no, actually it's not the end of the discussion. It's right, but he wanted to make himself a cup of tea. Now, do you see the point I'm going to make? Two explanations. Electrical energy being transformed, wanting to make a cup of tea. Rhodes' point is really very, very simple. These are not alternative explanations. It's not as if you say, right, I want to make a cup of tea, no other explanation is required. It's not as I'm saying, look, it's all about electrical energy being converted. That's part of the picture, but there's a bigger picture. What you might like to think about is this, that science is very, very good dealing with functionality, with structures, with how the universe works. But maybe we need to think also about what things mean. And that's a different level. Do you see that point? That's not in any way invalidating science. It's simply saying we need a bit more than that to build on what science is saying. Science fills in part of the big picture, but not the whole thing. And you and I need that bigger picture if we're going to lead out meaningful lives. So for me, that is really a very important point. I think a point we could build on it is this, and again, you might find that this is quite an important point. Again, Richard Dawkins and I have some wonderful conversations, and we do disagree quite a lot. And we both love science, by the way. We think that's very good news. And we just disagree about what happens after that. But Dawkins, I think, is right to say, look, you can't just believe anything. You've got to have reasons for believing. I think he's absolutely right. I think where I disagree with him is that we need to be very, very alert to the fact that there are some things that you certainly can prove, but others that you cannot. But nonetheless, you can say, I've got good reasons for thinking that this might be right. I mentioned C.S. Lewis earlier, and Lewis shifted from atheism to Christianity, and it was quite a complicated process. I mean, one of the things was he found his atheism didn't actually really do anything very much for him. But he also, I think, was looking for, well, I've used that phrase, the big picture, I mean, a theory, a way of looking at things which made sense. And in a little piece of 1930, Lewis wrote these words, I'm an empirical theist who arrived at faith by induction. Now, it's very interesting. I want you to hold that in your mind. What is he saying? Something like this, I think. If you say induction is the basic approach of the natural sciences. In other words, you have all these observations. And the question is, what theory? A theory is basically a way of beholding things, a way of looking at it. What theory seems to make the most sense of what it is that we actually experience or observe in the world? And you try them out. You try to figure out which one fits best. What's the best fit, if you like, between theory and evidence? And Lewis's argument, which of course may be wrong, but he found it reasonably compelling, was that his Christian faith gave him a lens through which he could look at the world and actually bring things into focus. Now, Lewis was very, very clear that he was an atheist for very good reasons. He lists them, And in moving away from atheism to Christianity, he was very clear. He felt he could give better reasons for being a Christian. There's no way of running away from reality. But I'm beginning to run out of time. And what I want to do, if I may, is just in this final bit of the lecture, talk a bit about, if I can put it, that's the cash value. I mean, if you like, the so what question, because I think that's a perfectly reasonable question to ask. And I'm going to tell you a story about me, which will probably persuade you that I was probably quite a strange child. But anyway, when I was young, I was at boarding school in Belfast, and actually I quite liked it. But quite often I'd lie awake on my bed at night, and I'd look at the stars. There's this window right beside my bed. I could look out and I could see the stars. And at certain times of the year, I could see the belt of Orion, that very nice group of 3 stars in the constellation Orion. And I found that actually they were beautiful, but actually in one sense it was unbearable to look at them. Why did I think that? Well, here is my reason, which again may persuade you that I'm slightly strange, but here we go. My thought was this: the light now leaving those stars, it's going to take about 100 years plus to get to Earth. So in effect, I'm seeing the stars as they were 100 years ago. And by the time it does get to Earth, I'll be dead. And so for me, those beautiful stars were actually a symbol of, well, transience, the shortness of life. For me, it was all about decay and death. And I found that a very, very unsettling thought, I have to say. But I'm not on my own. Some of you may have read a book by Ursula Goodenough. Ursula Goodenough is a cell biologist at the University of Washington. And she wrote a book called The Sacred Depths of Nature, which just talked about having an existential crisis as a teenager. In effect, just in effect saying, look, this universe is going to end, I'm going to end. I can't bear to look at it because it's just too hard. It raises all these deep questions. It makes me very sad. And she writes at the end of her discussion of this, so I try not to think about these things. But it's very hard not to think about these things. And so for me, as a young child, as an atheist, I was quite clear there was no purpose, nothing. The stars were simply a symbol of transience and mortality. Nowadays, I would look at Orion's belt, and I do it in a very different way. And let me try and explain the difference it makes. I now look at it through a Christian lens, if you like, Christian big picture. And the thought that goes through my mind is something you find in Psalm 8. It's a very short psalm. Some of you have read it. The psalmist begins by saying, when I look at the heavens, the work of your fingers, and just says, look how big it is. And what are we? What am I? Why should anyone care for me? Because I'm so small. And then it goes into this lyrical description of, yes, the universe is very, very big and I'm very, very small, but God loves me and I matter to him. And that actually is a kind of thought that's there. It doesn't contradict science. It just gives you this added dimension which really moves you in a very different direction. But you'll say, well, you're you. I mean, give us a better example. So here we go. We're going to end with Albert Einstein, who I like. Albert Einstein has this wonderful quote, and he says, the eternal mystery of the universe is its comprehensibility. In other words, why can we make so much sense of it? It's a good question. And Lewis's point is we can answer that from a Christian perspective. But here's the interesting point about Einstein. Einstein was very unsure about the theory of relativity, not in the sense of the science, but about whether there was something more that needed to be said. And during the late 1940s, early 1950s, he had long conversations with an Austrian philosopher called Rudolf Carnap, who was at Princeton at the time. And Carnap said, look, Einstein was haunted by this realization that his wonderful theory of relativity gave him a beautiful insight into a little bit of reality, but didn't answer all the big questions. He had this haunting sense that there was something really significant, I quote, on the far side of physics. Here is a quote from a letter of condolence that Einstein wrote when his friend Michel Bessot died. And Einstein wrote to his family and said, well, of course, poor Michel, he's left this world a little bit sooner than the rest of us, but we physicists know that the past, present, and future, all that's happened is that Michel has moved from the present to the past. So there we are. We believing physicists know that's all there is to it. Now, I sometimes wonder what Bessot's family thought when they read that. But actually, the physics is absolutely right. There's a world line, past, present, future. We are at this point, and at some point we'll be on a different point. And that is right. Do you understand? It's right. But it's not enough. And the point that Rudolf Carnap was making is that Einstein agonized over the existential blackness, darkness of his theory, because he was absolutely convinced it was right, but he was intensely aware that there probably had to be more to be said if you were going to make sense of life, not just physics. So I'm going to end there and leave you with that thought. The key point I'm making is that science is great. Please hear me say that. I love it. Love it to bits, but it's incomplete. And you and I as human beings need more than that. And the big question on the table really is, where do we find that more? We can talk about these things shortly, but that's my bit. I'm very happy now to hand back to my colleague here.
We'll take a very short break. Do grab some more food and some more drink, and we'll come back together in 5 minutes for a time of Q&A.